pause to jump right in.
Go jump right in.
Okay. Well, welcome to our next panel. This is a wonderful opportunity to bring together some of my favorite people that I work with in all sorts of different ways. I'm Andrew Brown. I'm the Vice Dean of Faculty Affairs and Professor of Experience here at WashU in Arts and Sciences. And I'm joined by Caldwell, who's our Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Diversity. So I've heard quite a bit. She's also a professor in the Department of African and African American Studies, and she's Distinguished Professorial Scholar of Arts and Sciences. Danielle Dutton, Associate Professor of English and Co-Director of Center for Literary Arts, accomplished office. Adia Harvey Wingfield, my colleague in the Dean's Office, the Vice Dean of Faculty Development and Diversity, and also a Professor of Sociology, the Mary Tileston Hemenway Professor of Arts and Sciences, and then Julia Bunker, we together all the time. Chair of Performing Arts Department, and also Professor of English and Performing Arts. So I told them that I would just punish whoever sat closest to me. So we're going to start off with Julia, then Adia, and then Adia.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Stephanie, for the invitation to come speak with you about the newly revised tenure policies in the Performing Arts Department, where I'm chair. I think I was invited because this is some kind of, we're the first to actually revise our tenure policy in light of creative research, but it's actually a story of struggle. So perhaps it will be instructive in that way as other departments make these transitions. Because performing arts is rather discipline specific in some respects, I'm going to tell that story, but I'm also trying to do so in a way that speaks more generally, in ways that perhaps the rest of you might draw lessons from as it's useful. And I thought the way I would do that would be to begin by putting in relationship to each other two key terms here for me: institutions on the one hand and performance on the other. So institutions, as rooted in their grounding metaphor, are structures that may reside in brick and mortar buildings, and here in Missouri, version of collegiate Gothic is done in pink granite. But they are, of course, ideological frameworks meant to administer a rational order within the larger project of knowledge production. Performances are what we do within these institutions, and often in response to the way that they guide our actions through them, whether to reproduce the institution, as Althusser suggests of ISAs, or to change it from within, which is what I suspect this whole panel today has been about. So when institutions function well, their administrative structures are more or less invisible to the people they serve because they facilitate the task of knowledge production efficiently and well. And when they don't, it's because the institution's structure has become ossified, compelling the performance of tasks that merely reproduce the authority of the institution for its own sake, which is why it's incumbent upon disciplines to self-regulate, changing to meet the needs of a changing world, and in particular a changing student body. This is difficult and it's scary, especially for those of our colleagues who feel threatened by change. But I found that if I begin by affirming the core values of our field in order to preserve them, I can achieve some success in changing the way we practice those values to meet the changing circumstances. So in the case of the Performing Arts Department, the structural changes in the American universities shift from the Cold War to the corporate model have been a mixed bag. Under the old Cold War model, my field's value was calculated at best in terms of cultural diplomacy. We were reminded of this legacy last April when at a retirement party for my colleague Christine Knobloch-O'Neill, who's a professor of the practice in dance. And in summarizing her many achievements over a 30-plus year career, I noted that the bronze medal that she won from the State Department representing the United States at the 1972 International Ballet Competition. The years since that commendation have been marked by a steep retraction in federal funding for the performing arts. They are now regarded as less a defining expression of a national culture than as a mere form of entertainment. But insofar as they can post a return on capital investment, as in the ideal of the blockbuster Broadway musical, they stand a chance of survival under the new corporate logic. The challenge for me as chair of the Performing Arts Department is to resist that instrumental logic by affirming the artistic and intellectual credentials of the performing arts and their capacity for producing knowledge within a university structure. Our new Arts and Sciences Strategic Plan has thrown me something of a lifeline in its recognition of the inherent value of interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity in its first pillar. Theater, after all, is the paradigmatic art form for interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary humanistic inquiry, given its Wagnerian combination of poetry, music, and dance, along with the visual arts, architecture, and more recently, multimediated technologies. And as for Wagner's poetry, the performing arts have historically drawn narratives from many languages and cultures around the world, making translation an integral part of these art forms, given the interlingual, intercultural, and intermedial dimensions. And translation has become my metaphor of choice for explaining the value of what we do in the PAD and advocating for it as something more than just a training ground for entertainers. In my personal quest to translate the value of the performing arts from a register of purely economic instrumentality to one that is more broadly humanistic, I emphasize the epistemological work that the performing arts do. In my recent book, for example, I argue that when societies undergo moments of profound cultural change, theater is often a highly charged site of influence. You can think of Shakespeare's Globe in the early modern period, Ibsen's stage realism, the rise of science and industrial technologies, or the forum theater of Auguste Beauvoir in the decolonization process. In short, the affective experience of enduring these profound cultural changes tend to appear first in the embodied art form of performance. Self-reflexively staged within a proscenium frame, those embodied formations create a perceptible gestalt around new ideas as they literally emerge into visibility before entering into consciousness and language. The performing arts, in other words, do produce ideas. Our institutions just haven't been very good about creating structural affordances that allow them to be recognized as such. And that has to do with a long history of the anti-theatrical prejudice in the academy. Fortunately for you, I don't have time to recount that history in all of its ugly detail. But the salient point for this conversation is that universities like this one have been slow to recognize the value of creative research in the performing arts as productive of tenure-worthy knowledge. In the Performing Arts Department, we did recently revise our tenure policies and guidelines to include creative research as well as the more legible academic forms that often result in books and articles. Our new tenure standards now also recognize the value of original plays and choreographies, writing for performance that results in experimental, immersive, and or multimediated live art, innovative set, costume, and lighting designs, and fully realized productions by either solo performers or ensembles that contributes to the interpretive history of classic stage plays or dance repertoires. This involves not only the addition of these previously overlooked artistic contributions, but also the clarification of existing metrics for evaluating a tenure dossier. While we have found guideposts in terms of quality, such as between a workshop and a fully realized stage production, and scale, such as between short-term and long-term projects requiring different investments in time and labor, we have resisted the urge to make false equivalences between different kinds of creative work and the more legible print standard of conference papers, articles, and books. While quality remains the core value in our assessments, flexibility in determining what constitutes a product of creative research is key, especially given the necessarily metamorphic nature of performance. Notably, many of its artistic forms are bound by space-time limitations. While designers can often accept commissions for productions that take place anywhere in the world, directors and choreographers cannot, since the material they work in, the bodies of actors and dancers, anchors them to a specific place and time. Accordingly, our tenure standards admit consideration of works created both within the university and outside of it, with video recordings and journalistic reviews allowed for the purposes of documentation only. Assessments are restricted to the original work of art, ensuring that its integrity as a living art form is maintained in terms of its situatedness in space and time, as well as that of the audience members who engage and interpret it. Whenever possible, external experts in the field should be invited to attend and review the live performance as part of the assessment process. I should note here that we did not develop this new policy ex nihilo. Despite WashU's tardiness in recognizing creative research in the performing arts, many peer institutions have done so for nearly a century, providing us with a model that is indeed a standard in the field. I should also note that this new policy does not apply retroactively to arts practice researchers currently in teaching track positions, despite the fact that at least 2 of my colleagues gave up tenure offers elsewhere to assume teaching track positions here. Rather, this policy allows us, in effect, to leapfrog from a benighted past of ignoring the value of this research altogether to a visionary future where the shape of traditional scholarship is transformed by creative practice, and creative practice is likewise transformed by a deeper engagement with various kinds of research across the disciplines, especially if it engages not only the interdisciplinary first pillar, but also the other 5 pillars outlined in the Arts and Sciences Strategic Plan. The performing arts have finally been invited to sit at the table for what comes here and next. Now that we have a dean who supports cutting-edge interdisciplinarity and creative research, and a tenure document that includes the kind of interdisciplinary creative research we do in the performing arts, we are able to think toward a future where the two-tiered teaching track and tenure track system don't necessarily map onto arts practice and more traditional kinds of scholarly research. Ideally, tenure eligibility will allow creative research in the performing arts to apply for competitive grants, residencies, and commissions that are currently out of reach. If they are successful, they can take sabbaticals and research leaves to work with nationally and internationally recognized companies, thus enhancing the research profile of departments like mine to realize the goal of academic excellence stated in both the university's vision for Here and Next and the School of Arts and Sciences strategic plan. Moreover, with the artistic and intellectual freedoms secured by tenure, such future creative researchers will be able to imagine and create works of art that are greater in significance and impact than mere entertainments that rely on profitable returns from hefty investments. My hope is that with this new expansion of our tenure policy, creative research in the performing arts will become more legible to idea producers in other disciplines at this and other universities. And if my thesis about the epistemological value of the performing arts is correct, this change in our tenure policy might create an opening for works of art that will help us all come to terms with the profound cultural changes at our time.
So Stephanie initially asked me to talk a bit about how we can support innovative scholarship, but I actually don't want to do that. I want to talk about something related, but not exactly
That's fine.
that, which is why I think it's so critical to import innovative scholarship and why that's so integral for universities right now at this current moment. In thinking about that, I want to start with a conversation I actually had this morning with the job candidate in our department who was discussing some of our strategies for thinking about how we provide graduate education and our views in sociology for how we make sure that students are trained to leave our departments. And I was drawing a contrast between what graduate school was like when I was a student many, many years ago and what I think the landscape and market for sociology and academic looks like now. And when I was a student, and probably many of you can relate to this, the expectation when you came out of graduate school was that you went to a university job. And even landing at a liberal arts college was considered failure because the expectation was that you would be at an R1 university job and that was just what you were going to graduate school for, and that other possibilities weren't really considered or taken seriously or even really thought about. And I don't think that's the landscape of academic work anymore. And at least in sociology, we don't have this mindset, and I think we can't afford to have this mindset that students are going to leave our PhD program and move into R1 jobs. And a lot of the reason for that has to do with how academic work has shifted and how the reputation and perspective around universities has shifted, right? We also know that as part of the way that we've seen society shift and change, we are experiencing a moment where there's a lot of a crisis of legitimacy for many institutions. And that includes, but is not limited to, universities. It includes media, government, government organizations, it includes the healthcare system, it includes doctors, it includes pretty much any area of legitimacy that you can think of, or any institution you can think of is facing this crisis of legitimacy. So to me, that actually sets the stage for why it's so important to think about doing innovative work, not necessarily how it's important to do it. And I think that when we consider where we are as people who work at universities, who aren't confronting this landscape anymore, where you could be reasonably assured that you would leave your PhD program and go out into another university job, I think it's important for us to think as workers at a university about what it is that we are providing and what we're doing and how that lands to a broader general public that may not have the same trust in us that they would have 20 or 30 years ago. And so when I think about, again, why it becomes important to do this, I think that one of the key areas for this stands in what universities can provide that I think other industries and other institutions and other settings can't. And that's a way to show that what we are providing and the type of knowledge that we are providing and the type of research and scholarship and creative practice and so forth that we're able to offer really has some significant impact and meaning outside of the university walls. One of the critiques that I often have of my own discipline, sociology, is that we spend a lot of time as sociologists talking to each other. And that's fine and good at conferences and meetings, but there's also a whole world out there outside of the American Sociological Association, and we should be a lot more invested in talking to that world. And I think when we want to consider why it's important to support innovative scholarship, it comes back to this question of showing what faculty and what universities can offer that links back to this broader world. And this is where I think this question of public scholarship comes in as an answer. And this is really the key point that I want to discuss in kind of a sideways answer to your question about how to support innovative work. One of the things that I think universities and faculty can offer that many other industries can't is to be able to show how what it is that we're doing really has some impact and has some meaning and some significance, again, outside of these insular circles that we can find ourselves talking to and talking within. But I think it's really critical and important for us to be able to understand how to think broadly past our university settings and to think and be able to engage in conversation with people who aren't necessarily PhDs in whatever our respective subject area is. And I think doing that helps to maybe not completely offset the legitimacy crisis, but it helps to show why what we're doing matters, and it helps to show why what we're doing is relevant and necessary and important and really has some meaning and some significance beyond just what we may do in classrooms and beyond what we might publish in journals and this beyond what we may engage in our creative practice. So what I do feel equipped to talk more about is how we've been trying to address that in sociology. And sociology is a somewhat it's a weird discipline in many ways, but it's also a somewhat unique one in the sense that there are more qualitative, more humanist adjacent sociologists in the field. There are more quantitative sociologists in the field as well, so it's kind of a hybrid of both of those. But one of the things that I feel good about what we have been doing in sociology, in terms of what we've been doing in sociology, has been to try to highlight how the work that we do does matter, again, outside of our professional associations, outside of our journals that are sponsored by the field, and outside of our insular networks. So when I think about my colleagues that I think are doing really valuable and important work in sociology, often these are people who are studying the questions that I think are really primary for our society today, things that relate to immigration, to healthcare, to climate change, to health disparities, right? All of those are things that, as we've seen certainly over the last 4 or 5 years or so, really matter and have real bearing for how we understand the world that we navigate and how we find ourselves as people who fit into that world, and what the institutions that we navigate mean for exacerbating or facilitating our access to various parts of the social world that's around us. So in sociology, we've taken a number of steps to try to amplify the work that colleagues are doing on those fronts. And that includes, from our main professional association, the American Sociological Association, developing a sociology action network where sociologists are paired with community organizations and other local groups in the event that those groups are interested in trying to pull from the expertise that various sociologists may have in those areas. So that might mean if you're a sociologist who studies law and legal representation, you might pair with, say, an Arch City Defenders to offer more information about your research and how that could potentially be useful to that particular group. We also have a lot of people who are working to kind of translate our research into public spaces through op-eds or through having conversations with media figures to talk about how our work has some insights for the topics that I just discussed and many others. And then there are examples of people who are just really very visible public sociologists, people like Alondra Nelson, who's a sociologist at Princeton, who's done a lot of work with the Biden administration to advance information about science and technology and AI and the potential for exacerbating racial disparities through that model. There is Matt Desmond, who's also a sociologist at Princeton, who's done a lot of work on poverty and inequality and eviction as a mechanism for facilitating that. And there are others who are not at Princeton also. Those were just the first two that came to my mind who were doing really great work, but that's by no means an exhaustive list. So I do want to say that one of the things that I think is important about where we are at WashU is that we're really at a pretty pivotal turning point, I think. Julia alluded to that in terms of the support that we have from the dean and his interest in facilitating interdisciplinary scholarship and innovative work. But I feel like, and clearly I have a bias since I'm co-directing the Public Scholarship Initiative, but I do feel like that also offers an example of ways that we are seeking to try to put in infrastructure in place that does facilitate this importance of public scholarship and connecting what we are doing on this campus to what's happening in St. Louis, what's happening in the region, what's happening in the U.S. at large. And I think that goes, again, kind of adjacently to answering this question of how we can think about supporting innovative work. I think that we have to. I think we have to support innovative work because we are at a point in academia where that's critical and essential and necessary for our continued survival. But I also think that at WashU we are starting to put together opportunities for thinking about public scholarship as a way of highlighting that innovative work and showcasing why it is that we do as academics deserve the legitimacy that we have had, and why we do deserve the support and trust of people outside of these spaces, because the work that we do really matters.
All right, hi everyone. So I want to thank Stephanie and the team for organizing this amazing event and for your vision, really bringing us all together, Stephanie. I'm going to ground my remarks in the work I'm collaborating on with Vice Provost Mary McKay and also our colleague Shalisa Holden as part of Here and Next. So Julia ended or mentioned Here and Next in her remarks. That's our university's new strategic plan, which began implementation last fall. So we're currently working with leaders of the Danforth schools. So if you're visiting, this is the Danforth campus, and then we have the medical campus across Forest Park. And we're working to incorporate most of the strategic plan's guiding principles into promotion and tenure criteria. So there are 5 guiding principles, which are academic distinction, community impact, equity, diversity, and inclusion, global perspective, and stewardship. We're mainly focusing on community impact, EDI, and global perspective in our work on faculty evaluations and promotions. Making community impact and EDI visible and how we evaluate faculty and reward this work are things that are important not only here at WashU, as we know, but also within higher education more generally. And we've been talking about this, for the whole day. Part of my role involves promoting best practices for faculty searches. So faculty recruitment and hiring is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and Andrew and Adia both know that. We really do need to think about the front end and what we put into our job ads and what we say we're hiring people to do, so that we're then actually evaluating them on those things. I think, not only do we need to embed these things in tenure and promotion, but also in how we're hiring people. And I feel like we've kind of done the opposite. We just had a panel of amazing early career scholars, but are we prepared now to fairly and equitably evaluate them, right, for tenure and promotion? So we put the cart before the horse a little bit, but we can do this. We can catch up. We here at WashU also are creating a new school of public health. It'll be the first school in 100 years, and this is an opportune time to also embed the things we're talking about beyond the humanities as we create that new school of public health. So the conversations we're currently having at WashU about considering community impact and EDI as part of faculty evaluation and promotion have largely focused on encouraging schools to allow faculty to demonstrate how their research, teaching, and service engage one or both of these areas. And it can be research, teaching, or service. And this would be optional for faculty rather than being a requirement. And that's, we can continue to discuss that as well. However, as we continue to implement the strategic plan, it would be invaluable to think about ways that we can incentivize research, teaching, and service in these areas, as well as work that incorporates a global perspective, which is, I do research in Latin America, and we are doing some good work around, sort of global engagement, but it could be stronger, I think, at the same time. Rewarding work in these areas will also be important through recognition in the form of teaching awards, seed grants, and through other means. And so there are conversations in the first couple of panels about elevating the work. How do we make it more prestigious? How do we recognize the work that we say that we value? Mary McKay earlier today might have mentioned the William H. Danforth St. Louis Confluence Award, which is a new award that was established last year for faculty. And it's an example of high-level recognition of faculty who do community-engaged work. It comes with a $50,000 cash prize. It's sponsored by a donor, and actually they're accepting applications for that prize again currently. This award honors and recognizes faculty members with ongoing and completed research that focuses on interdisciplinary community-engaged research that exemplifies impact, innovation, and deep engagement with the St. Louis region. So community engagement and EDI-related work, as we know, often go unrecognized, and faculty long have not had this type of work, have had to do this type of work in addition to more traditional scholarship, thus creating an additional layer of work and creating a situation where significant areas of faculty work do not count toward promotion and tenure, right? So someone mentioned the invisible CV for grad students. There's kind of an invisible CV for many faculty as well, right? So the lack of recognition of this work, as we often know, also creates or has a disproportionate impact on minoritized faculty, and in numerous cases has led to these faculty not being awarded tenure. So when we think about attrition, there are so many factors there. that are pushing people out of the academy. Broadening what types of work count toward promotion and tenure and making non-traditional work visible is critical to attracting and retaining innovative scholars. We've been talking about innovation in higher education, and also ensuring that we evaluate their research, teaching, and service in an equitable and holistic manner. So those are my prepared comments. I think I may have 2 more minutes or so, hopefully. Yeah, so I wanted to just add some reflections based on what I was hearing earlier today. One is that I spent 16 years at UNC Chapel Hill before I came here, and something that happened in arts and sciences there is that they mandated that all departments include community engaged service or community engaged work as part of tenure and promotion requirements. Now, how that played out is something else. Whether departments actually did it, but there was a mandate from the dean's office to say this work matters. And so, at what point do we also start to have different forms of mandates to incentivize this work? Mary and I, along with Shalisa and leaders from both campuses, worked on the creation of a new interdisciplinary joint appointments policy. So that ties in with something that Cal mentioned earlier in terms of really streamlining the requirements for promotion and tenure and having clarity from the point that people are appointed across schools about how much service they have to do in each department or each school and so forth. So that is something that's new as of last spring here at WashU. With regards to service equity, that's another area that we need to be really thinking about in terms of tenure and promotion. Joy mentioned, so I think that's something that, I love the categories, I don't know where Joy is, but that she mentioned earlier, the new categories and thinking more expansively, and how service and workload equity play into that, I think is something we need to be thinking about. I also, Antoinette talked about, it made me think about University 101. This notion that our faculty need to understand how the university works. You shouldn't have to become a chair or a dean for that to happen. We should all know how the university works, and this came up. Yeah, so maybe we can do something around that, because it is complex, but if you don't understand the budget model used, that has a lot to do with how we function, right? Especially here. So we're very decentralized, and it's driven by our budget model in a lot of ways. And then I just wanted to end by mentioning Carrie Ann O'Meara's work. And we have a recording of her presentation from last spring. She's done a lot of work on many topics, but on equitable faculty evaluations. And so I have a copy of a couple of her reports in my bag. Her recording is on our Faculty Affairs website, her presentation from last spring. So these are things that we've been thinking about in terms of the Provost's office, but we do need to partner with our schools and with our departments to really embed some changes, in our policies and our criteria.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Stephanie, for inviting me. And I think I'm here in part as one of the co-directors of the brand new Center for the Literary Arts, and I will talk a little bit about that at the end, but my remarks will actually be framed mostly around my experience as one of the I was hired for creative practice. So I'm one of the people on campus who went through the entire tenure process as a creative practitioner, and I just wanted to talk a tiny bit about how that went. So one of the shared questions in the announcement, in the language for today, I was rereading it. How do we move beyond traditional requirements for tenure dossiers in the humanities, monographs, and articles to encompass newer ways of doing humanities research? And it's that word, research. Public humanities, digital humanities, creative practice. And as I was thinking about that, it just occurred to me that that I could talk to about how professional evaluation in terms of creative practice currently exists. Because that panel that just happened, the wonderful what do you say? Not junior, early career. I learned from Stephanie to stop saying junior faculty, but then I couldn't remember what to say instead. Sorry. In terms of this idea of the cart and the horse, I feel like it's important just for a moment to pause and hear what it's like when you're on the creative practice stream. The tenure process is obviously really challenging and intimidating for everyone who goes through it, but I think there are some specific challenges for creative practitioners. So unsurprisingly, there's actually nothing built into the tenure process that welcomes deviation from a traditional scholarly model. so as a creative writer, I don't really like that term either, when I go up for tenure or promotion, I am asked to respond to questions in categories that were conceived with scholarship in mind. For example, I'm asked to explain the innovation, impact, and engagement of my research in my research statement, but I don't do research. And actually, just last week, the current Pulitzer Prize winner, Hernan Diaz, in this very room, Hernan Diaz writes historical novels and was asked about his research. And boy, he really had a lot to say about being asked about research. He actually has a traditional scholarly literature PhD from NYU, and he just wanted to make it really clear that creative writers don't do research, that this is a term that has basically nothing to do with the novelist's experience. And he said, we as writers have our own word for what we do, and it is reading. That was really fun. So just another example, despite being a creative writer, I'm still always asked to define my work in terms of peer review. So this is a term and a process that does not exist in my field. So when I compiled my materials for tenure, I had to decide what to say when I got to the question, how many of your publications were peer reviewed? And you have to give an actual number. I mean, you have to count them and then tell how many of those. And so it doesn't, I mean, is my answer 0? Like, it doesn't feel good to have to put 0, because I know what peer review means to all of you. So to say 0 feels uncomfortable, but it does, I'm really worried about putting NA, and who's going to be looking at this, and despite, you know, senior colleagues assuring me that it will be fine, it doesn't feel fine to me in that moment. And then do I need to like have an addendum explaining that like everything that I wrote was peer reviewed, but we don't call it peer review, but I didn't self-publish any of this. So I feel like this might all sound like I'm just quibbling over semantic distinctions. Well, I mean, obviously I navigated it. Here I am, I have tenure. But it's not nothing either. I think that like the bias of institutional language away from creative practice is alienating for anyone who understands their purpose at the university as being foremost to pursue creative work. So implicitly, if not intentionally, it says you are not doing the real work that we value, so figure out how to squeeze yourself into the parameters of what the real thing is. And it seems to me precisely the bias that we're convened here to discuss, since the lack of institutional credit for certain kinds of cultural production on the scholarly side is rooted in the same institutional impulse that results in promotion guidelines that creative practitioners have to squeeze into, and of course the terms we use to talk about things frame how we prioritize them and understand them. So I think if we do want to rethink these systems, we have to understand how deeply rooted this bias actually is, to the point where I think it's almost invisible to people. Like I was in some conversation with Stephanie, and I was saying like, oh, I just, every time someone says the word research, I just like have to throw it out and translate it for something else. But you know, why should everybody who's not always doing research have to do that? Like, there should be a bunch of slashes on the page, you know, I think, so to make it more fluid, more welcoming. And I actually do think that a semantic shift could be a start into opening this up and making it all a bit more flexible. Not only, so if it was that uncomfortable and nervous-making for me when I was hired to do creative practice, I can't imagine how this feels to someone who was hired not to do creative practice and is trying to like bring that in. Yeah. So finally, just to come back around to the Center for the Literary Arts, I just want to say the fact that the university has so recently decided to support a center dedicated to creative practice is incredibly encouraging and I think a really positive step. So my co-director Ignacio Infante is in the back, and we have envisioned the CLA as a generative space for programming, fellowships, and for community for creative practitioners, and not people who are just hired for creative practice, but anyone who's doing creative practice on campus. Where was I? Oh, so that demonstrates what support for creative practice could look like inside the academy, and our hope is that these programs will not only be worthwhile in themselves, but also in the example they provide of what creative practice has to offer academic culture as a step toward creating the broad-based creative and intellectual academic environment that we believe is so important to the vibrancy and the future of academic life.
Okay. Well, thank you all. It's been great to work with all of you, and Danielle's given me some stuff to work on and templates to develop. This is something that in the Dean's office we've been extraordinarily committed to. Is while respecting the height of the bar, showing that there are all sorts of ways to jump over it, and part of which has been alienating. We need to do better on that part, though. Own our part, and then the provost also asked for a number of peer review articles. So that's something for you to work on.
More things for Kia.
No, like I said, there's a big portion of it in arts and sciences that we need to work on.
It is getting better, I will say. I've been noticing creative practice popping up.
Well, I don't want to give credit to Deanna Barch, who is our Vice Dean of Research. She doesn't say that, well, we don't say the other part, but she always does, and that's why the credit goes to her. She is the Vice Dean of Research, Scholarship, and Creative Practice, and she always makes sure to say all three, even if we badly abbreviate it to research from time to time. But the commitment to value all of the different ways that we exhibit our brilliance is something that has been one of the reasons that I've been in this position now for 2.5 years, and part of the reason that I got on board was because there was a new vision for how we could support our tenure track faculty and our teaching track faculty as well, even though we have certain strictures written into our tenure, the university tenure document, making processes as clear and transparent and fair and supportive as possible has been key to let's open it up for questions, comments. We'll step in to defend arts and sciences.
You don't have to defend us.
Defend our own.
I mean, a couple people's remarks really reminded me that one of the values of Imagining America is nothing is entirely new. I mean, A.B. Du Bois did sociology in the real world. William Julius Wilson, one of my professors at the University of Chicago. So these are not new phenomena. It's now that people are really pushing at institutions to talk in language that can be understood, and these are not just sort of people on the outside who are doing great work, and so but we let them do it over there. And same with creative practice. I don't really know all the ways the structure is done here, but one of the reasons I always say that faculty in arts and sciences can evaluate work that's not in their own discipline is because we have a visual and performing arts school. We have people who are playwrights, composers. When I read all the tenure dossiers, I was listening to cassettes of operas and organ music and having to make sense of them inside of the constitution of the language as we had set it up. So I think it is a time to push for that kind of, I like your idea, the semantic reformation maybe of the institution that really reminds people that we do know how to do this. We have done this. These practices have existed in the world, and there are people, you don't need to reinvent the wheel in a way because there are people out in the world doing this work as well, and we're perfectly comfortable to say, that stinks, that's great.
Yeah, and I'll just, having been occasionally on reading internal grants here, if someone's applying with something that's approaching creative practice and there's no language in the rubric for determining how to read that, it is really confusing. And so I think being on the other side of it, I feel like so nervous to have to enter into a space where I'm going to be assessed, but there's not really clarity on how that assessment's happening here.
Hi, thank you all so much. I have a question about departmental tenure documents. So this might be especially directed to Julia and also to Adia. Talking about things like public scholarship. It feels like maybe sometimes that gets lumped into service, like service and public engagement. But I wondered, Adia, with sociology's emphasis on these kinds of public engagement, has that been revised into or built into the departmental tenure document? And then I just kind of wanted to ask Julia about how your department got started. Is there anything that you feel like other chairs should know about opening discussions about revising tenure documents with with their colleagues in their departments. So sorry, that's sort of a two-headed question, but in my mind, they were connected somehow.
Yeah, so in our department, we have not formally adjusted the tenure standards to state that public scholarship is an expectation or anything like that. And I don't think we're going to, because our goal has been to try to institute more of a cultural shift in support of doing this type of work, rather than to mandate it as an expectation for all faculty, right? And like I said, I don't foresee that changing. I don't think that we want to be a department where we're saying that public scholarship is an expectation for promotion and tenure. I think we're still very firmly in the camp that we want to see excellence in research and teaching, and that we still want to see early career faculty doing very well with service. But kind of what I wanted to allude to before in giving more of an overview was that sociology as a discipline has really changed a lot in terms of the view of this type of public work. I think you make a great point that it's always been there, but it's also been very marginalized in sociology in a lot of ways, right? And there has for a long time been an ethos in sociology that's exactly what you described. You might do that on the side, and maybe we're okay with it, maybe we're not, but that's not a thing that we're going to encourage. And so what we want to shift is a culture in our department where public work doesn't have to be this thing that you do on the side that you keep a secret from the later career faculty in your department who are going to be reviewing your tenure record. We want to develop a culture where it's encouraged, it's expected, it's encouraged and it's fine and it's not unremarkable, and that senior faculty set a model for that, but we also want to be clear what is going to be key in your promotion process is going to be, again, excellence in research and teaching and service. So if you're not doing those things, but you're doing a whole lot of public scholarship, you should have a conversation with your faculty mentor really early on to reset that path.
I'm going to jump in on this real quick. So part of the reason that we don't set these types of expectations for tenure is because we're very wary of creating requirements that we don't actually require. And we're extraordinarily sensitive to this idea that if you see this as a box and don't check it, then you are going to be punished. And so we're very careful of that part. So one of the things that I love about what Julie has done is, in their department, is that they've developed a how, even more than a what. This is how we approach the metrics and all of the evidence that shows that this is worthy of tenure, and being very careful to provide that out. I wanted to also provide an example of some of the stuff that we get into, where I had mentioned these third-year reviews earlier in the day. As we, and before I get to that, I should note that when we were writing some of our offer letters to some of these people that are doing interesting stuff, we would bake into the offer letter certain expectations about tenure. So we were actually trying to get the horse out in front of the cart. So we did do that, not for Danielle, but well, maybe we did. I just wasn't part of that. But.
Well, it's separate when you're hired for creative practice. It's like a weird entity.
Yeah.
There's not that many of us on campus.
But one of the things that came out in a third-year review as we were looking at somebody that works on digital humanities is that it was clear that the department, I think the department was okay but needed some help, and it was also important for the kind of arts and sciences full professors that were looking at it to have some tools. And so we convened a group of people to talk, to both incorporate the stuff that professional organizations have done on digital humanities, but also come up with some internal arts and sciences guidelines for how do we assess digital humanities. And that, as I mentioned earlier, it seemed especially important that we be able to do that from this arts and sciences perspective, where I know how computer scientists run a tenure dossier and what's important there, whereas somebody in the English department less knows about that. So here's how you realize that conference proceedings are actually a really big deal, or tracking how code is used is a big deal. And then what we do then, what we're in the midst of doing right now, is providing a series of hows to assess whether this is actually something that clears the bar or not. And I'll let you
well, again, I guess I feel like the performing arts is sort of the photo negative of a lot of the disciplines we're trying to create public-facing metrics to evaluate public-facing contributions, because we've been doing public-facing work from the get-go. We just have not been getting credit for it in terms of tenurability. So the challenge for me, and in answer to your question, is to ask my colleagues to think about what is the inherent artistic and intellectual value of this work on its own terms, rather than as something that you can sell a ticket to and that is a measure of its value in society. And as I mentioned, I mean, it was a little bit scary for a lot of my colleagues because they don't want to have to come to terms with identifying those values is a good thing, right? Because we can all come to terms with that. And that was a really lovely exercise we did early in my term as chair, to re-identify for ourselves core values that we had sort of lost sight of because it's just what we do. But using that as the basis to be able to change practices around how we honor those values was the challenge, because a lot of people like doing what they've been doing for 40 years. And getting them to say, you can change that, but we're going to keep this. We're going to keep what's really important about this art form. And we want to honor it in ways that people now in the 21st century can recognize. And it's just a kind of balancing act. Creating consensus around the values that are eternal, and then inviting people to let go a little bit of habits that they've had.
I'm really interested in the function of different aspects of this day together, and where you want this to go for you as an institution, and what will come out of the dean's office, and what comes out of departments, and what kinds of processes you need across the whole campus, and where you want to lead nationally on this stuff, and where all of this fits in your strategic planning conversations that you've been having. I mean, is this the first time some of you have talked about this together, or is this part of an ongoing set of conversations?
Well, I feel like I've just finished bugging Andrew about some of the stuff last week. I mean, individually
I've talked to everybody.
Yeah, some of them are new conversations, but we're really excited at the Center for the Literary Arts to be, having these conversations like at the dean's office level now about the importance of creative practice and the creative practice community on campus. That feels really important and really exciting. So that's something that's happening a lot now.
Yeah, some conversations have happened. We started some last spring around tenure and promotion at the university level, in terms of these guiding principles being infused, not as mandates, but really providing an opportunity for faculty to make their work visible so that it's not hidden and kind of tucked away somewhere and doesn't get any credit. But I do think we need to have continuing conversations, and it also goes beyond the humanities. Like, this is a really important starting point, but we need to be having them with STEM and social sciences. And
this is the first time we've come together around this, other than in a committee, because I know with the Provost office. So this is, and I can only speak about the humanities. I have no idea what is going on in STEM, although I sit on the tenure committee and I read the letters from the mathematicians with the equations in it.
Nobody does.
Yeah, but
mathematicians.
Chris and I plan to keep going with this, but I guess our STEM colleagues feel that, or our more quantitative social science colleagues feel that this is. But I think that the problem is different, Paula, because people in STEM are not faced with the kind of pressure that we are in the humanities to constantly be justifying our existence. And I do not want to ever talk about the crisis, but there are real things happening which put pressure on us to want to really think how we're supporting innovation and how we're supporting transformation and how we're supporting change, because it's much more urgent for us. I think Joy has a question.
Well, I wanted to know if, and I guess especially from the administrators in the group, but also faculty, if you were part of the conversation, if you've had conversations with or talked to or learned from faculty and administrators in the professional schools on campus, because schools of law or architecture or public policy or business or medicine have often
figured these questions out, I mean, in their own way, and it won't translate perfectly and maybe at all, but I was wondering if where conversations sit there. I mean, also in terms of funding resources and getting the attention of the highest levels of administration and the trustees, you know, that can be exceptionally useful, you know, to kind of reach out proactively and say, we're not waiting for you to call on us, we're actually going to, we want to control this conversation with you in the professional levels.
Kia brings us
Well,
together.
yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about innovation as one example. You know, how do other fields look at innovation or a business school? And I think rankings, we cannot downplay the importance of rankings because they are using traditional metrics. And so I do think this relates to conversations earlier in the day about, you know, no one wants to get out there because you're going to get your hand slapped, right? Like you're going to go down in the rankings and so, I don't know. We do have actually a new business school dean, and I think he's probably in favor of innovation and has a lot of great ideas. But I think there's a sense that we need to stick with what we know. That will keep us, you know, kind of where we are or help us go higher in some of the professional fields. You don't think so?
I think it was a great idea and we don't do it, and I think we should do it. I think it would be very useful for us to bring in the folks from the B school
Oh, no, I'm
and
not
the,
saying,
and the law school and hear how
And
they're.
I wasn't saying I wasn't saying we shouldn't do that.
I have not been at an occasion in which folks from the B school and folks from the law school speak about their tenure processes with arts and sciences faculty in
Well,
those.
we've never really ever had a conversation about
I'm just
tenure.
saying, it's a great idea.
But at this point, I'm like, anything we haven't done, it probably will work because things we've been doing have not worked.
So Liz has a question and then Jeanette had a question.
Everything, you know, goes around, comes around. And 20 years ago, there was a lively discussion of whether art history should get sucked into the Sam Fox school. And we stayed
She's
for
our
a few
arts
minutes
school of
talking.
architecture.
But it is true that they deal with creative practice every day. And if you talk to Patricia Olenek about her research, it's reading, it's looking, it's learning new crafts, new techniques. And I know we have lots of informal conversations about that, but maybe there's time for us to have some more stage conversations to help you all, because they have a whole set of language of how to evaluate an artist for tenure. They've been doing it for 40 years. And look, we don't want to run only with that model, but there are things about it that can help us tremendously. So it's just things come around for conversations when they're relevant, when they're helpful. Maybe it's helpful now. And there are some people who are cross-appointed. Dutton, for example, who has an appointment in AMCS and who really is a practicing illustrator and loves the history of architecture. And there are interfaces with history and theory. And it's important to keep the separation, but I think at times we've lost our capacity for the advancing conversations and mutual understandings, because everyone does research now, and they use that word, and it's okay. So, that's just it.
Yeah, this probably is going to sound a little trivial, but I wonder what kind of communication plan the university has for this work, and also, I'm a historian, so what is the archive capture plan? Or it does feel like a sea change is happening here. How are you capturing it as it happens? And how will you represent it to the variety of constituencies so that the intellectual dimensions and the taste and feel of the intellectual rationale that Julia so beautifully, I think, articulated is not lost in a kind of Marcom, outward-facing, et cetera, so that the integrity, the intellectual, scholarly, artistic, maker integrity of this project is actually being represented in ways that are legible to some and illegible to others, but meeting the challenge of crossing that kind of boundary.
Good question. I haven't got the answer.
Yeah.
Well,
So far,
go ahead.
I was going to say, so far our approach has been working with chairs and directors, and that's been working sort of.
Well, it's an infrastructure question, isn't it? Yeah. Because how does what's happening bubble up from the department level if there's no communication specialist embedded, or the opportunity for that to be embedded, at the local level? It's an infrastructure question.
It's always an infrastructure question. That's how we started today.
Well, there will be communication also because this falls under the faculty growth and development initiative, which is part of the strategic plan, so we will be reporting out to the board of trustees in terms of OKRs, you know, in a very sort of corporate sense, what's happening. So, for instance, the interdisciplinary joint appointments policy, that was an objective. We reached that objective. We now have that policy. But as these promotion and tenure policies change, we'll be trying to document that and create a story around that as well. Yeah.
Well, we need to wrap up.
So we have the last peak panel of the day before the dean comes and gives his closing remarks will be a conversation between Paula and Joy and facilitated by myself. But there is some coffee out there, so let's grab some coffee and come back in. And no lurking in the hallway, please.
Thank you again.